Can a simple farmhand protect an entire town from a ruthless gang of outlaws? What happens when a man trying to escape his violent past is forced to confront it head-on? The Blackwood Raiders thought they found an easy target in sleepy Pine Valley, but they're about to learn that appearances can be deadly deceiving. The man they mock as a simple stable boy has more notches on his gun than their entire gang combined. Thomas "Ghost" Riley, the bounty hunter they all feared 5 years ago, is about to show them exactly why he earned that name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Pine Valley like a shroud, obscuring the distant peaks of the Sawback Mountains. Thomas Riley moved through the Norton family stables with practiced efficiency, his calloused hands working quickly as he fed the horses their morning oats. At 35, he possessed the kind of weathered strength that came from years of hard work, though few would guess the true nature of that work. His face, once renowned in wanted posters across 3 territories, had softened somewhat during his 5 years of peaceful labor, but his eyes remained sharp as ever, missing nothing. The stable walls were solid oak, well-maintained despite their age. Thomas had reinforced them himself when he first took the job, though old Martha Norton just thought he was being thorough. She didn't know that those walls had been carefully designed to stop bullets, or that the seemingly decorative metal bracings could serve as shooting positions if needed. The habits of his former life died hard, even after 5 years of trying to forget. To the good people of Pine Valley, he was simply Tom the stable hand, the quiet man who kept the Norton Ranch running smoothly and occasionally helped neighboring farms with their more difficult horses. His skill with troubled animals was well known, though few understood that it came from years of reading body language and anticipating sudden violence. A spooked stallion wasn't so different from a cornered gunman, after all. The Norton Ranch sat at the valley's heart, its sprawling pastures bordered by aspen groves that blazed gold in the autumn light. Thomas had chosen this place carefully when he decided to disappear, remote enough to discourage casual visitors, but close enough to town to hear important news. More importantly, it was owned by Martha Norton, a shrewd widow who asked few questions and valued loyalty above all else. This morning, like every morning for the past 5 years, Thomas rose before dawn to tend to the horses. The routine helped quiet the memories that still haunted his dreams, memories of gunsmoke and blood, of desperate men making fatal choices, of the reputation that had made Ghost Riley a name spoken in whispers around campfires. But this morning was different. As he worked, his trained ears caught the sound of approaching riders. Through the morning mist, he counted 6 horses moving along the valley road. Their riders sat too straight, their guns too well maintained for simple travelers. These were professional men, and Thomas recognized their kind immediately. The Blackwood Raiders had finally reached Pine Valley. 3 days ago, Sheriff Cooper had stopped by the ranch, ostensibly to discuss a missing horse. "They hit Golden Creek," he'd said quietly, helping Thomas mend a fence. "Killed 2 men, took everything of value. Word is, they're working their way through the smaller valleys, looking for easy targets." The sheriff's eyes had drifted to Thomas's hands, noting how they never seemed to develop the permanent dirt stains common to farm workers. But he'd asked no questions, and Thomas had offered no answers. Now, as the riders drew closer, Thomas adjusted his worn work shirt, making sure it hung loose enough to hide the twin revolvers strapped to his ribs. 5 years ago, he'd been the most feared bounty hunter in the territories, known for bringing in men that others wouldn't dare pursue. They called him Ghost, because he could track a man through impossible terrain, appearing seemingly out of nowhere to deliver justice. But that life had ended in blood and fire, leaving him with scars both visible and hidden. The riders reined up at the ranch gate, their horses' hooves kicking up small clouds in the morning frost. Thomas kept his movements deliberately casual as he continued his work, though his mind was already cataloguing weapons, positions, and tactical advantages, old habits that had kept him alive through countless confrontations. "Morning, friend," called the leader, a tall man with a distinctive black duster and a silver-plated revolver worn cross-draw style. Thomas recognized him immediately. Marcus "Black Jack" Turner, wanted in 4 territories for murder and robbery. The bounty on his head alone would have once been enough to tempt Thomas back into his old life. "Wondering if you might point us toward the main house. Need to have a word with whoever runs this spread." "Mrs. Norton's not receiving visitors this early," Thomas replied, pitching his voice higher than normal, adding a slight tremor that suggested nervousness. "But I can tell her you stopped by." The raiders exchanged amused glances. This was exactly what they expected, a simple farmhand scared of armed men. Thomas noted how they had unconsciously spread out in a standard offensive formation, professional work, but predictable to someone who had spent years studying such things. "Not very hospitable," Turner said, his hand resting casually on his gun. "Heard tell the Norton widows got quite a nice operation here. Fine horses, good water rights. Shame if something were to happen to it." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. "Please, gentlemen," Thomas stammered, letting his hands shake slightly as he set down a bucket. "Mrs. Norton's a kind woman. She helps a lot of folks around here. If you need money—" Turner's laugh cut him off. "Money? No, friend, we're businessmen. We're here to discuss protection. Times are dangerous, after all. Raiders, outlaws." His smile showed too many teeth. "Why, just last week we heard about a gang hitting Golden Creek. Terrible business. But for a reasonable monthly payment, we can ensure nothing like that happens here." Thomas clutched his pitchfork tighter, a gesture that looked like fear but actually gave him a better fighting stance. Through the stable's back window, he caught a glimpse of movement, more riders approaching from the north, just as he'd expected. The Blackwood raiders always split their forces, keeping a reserve out of sight to deal with any resistance. I'll have to ask Mrs. Norton," Thomas said, his voice cracking perfectly. "She handles all the business matters." "Tell you what," Turner dismounted, his spurs jingling against the packed earth. "Why don't you run and get her now? We'll just have a look around while we wait. Make sure everything's secure." As Thomas turned toward the house, apparently eager to comply, he noticed several of the raiders eyeing the horses with professional interest. They'd clearly marked the best animals, probably planning to take them along with whatever else they could steal. Their confidence, their casual dismissal of the nervous, stable hand was exactly what Thomas had counted on. Little did they know, but every detail of this encounter had been carefully orchestrated. The seemingly random placement of wagons and farm equipment actually provided perfect cover for the firing positions Thomas had prepared years ago. The nervous stable hand they dismissed so easily had spent the last 5 years planning for exactly this type of situation, haunted by the certainty that his violent past would eventually catch up with him. Black Jack Turner and his raiders were about to learn why Ghost Riley had been the most feared bounty hunter in 3 territories. But first, Thomas had to play his role perfectly, maintaining the facade of the frightened farmhand just a little longer. As he walked toward the main house, he felt the familiar calm settling over him, the deadly focus that had once made him legend. His mind drifted briefly to the hidden cache beneath the stable floorboards, where his old bounty hunter gear lay wrapped in waxed cloth, including the distinctive silver-inlaid Winchester that had helped build his reputation. Tut, youngest of Turner's men, barely more than a boy with a patchy beard and ill-fitting gun belt, called out nervously, "Boss, these horses, some of them got army brands, military stock." Turner's eyes narrowed as he examined the nearest stall. Interesting choice of horses. For a widow's ranch, he mused, his previous contempt giving way to something sharper. Friend, hold up a moment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas paused, keeping his posture deliberately submissive. Inside, his mind was already calculating angles, distances, analyzing which raiders would react first when the shooting started. The military horses were no accident. He'd specifically chosen them because their presence would eventually raise questions. Better to control. When those questions arose, something's been bothering me, Turner continued, moving closer. Been hearing stories about Pine Valley, about how no gang ever seems to get a foothold here, how trouble just seems to disappear. He emphasized the last word meaningfully. Almost like a ghost. Thomas let his shoulders tense, as if the word had struck a nerve. It had, but not for the reasons Turner suspected. The last time someone had called him ghost, 3 men had died, and he'd sworn to leave that life behind. He'd chosen Pine Valley specifically because it was peaceful, because Martha Norton had offered him a chance at redemption without asking about his past. I don't know anything about that, sir, Thomas replied, his voice still carefully modulated, to suggest fear rather than the cold calculation actually running through his mind. Mrs. Norton just likes good horses, says they're more reliable. Turner's hand drifted to his gun, but Thomas noted the man's stance was still casual. He hadn't put the pieces together yet, was just playing with what he thought was a frightened servant. Reliable, yes, like a good stable hand who knows how to keep his mouth shut, eh? The other raiders had spread out further, some examining the barn's sturdy construction with professional interest. Thomas knew they were marking defensive positions, planning how to fortify the ranch once they took it. Standard procedure for the Blackwood Raiders: secure a strong point, then use it as a base for further operations. What they hadn't noticed was how the barn's apparent weaknesses, the gaps in the walls, the partially open hayloft, were actually carefully designed. Firing positions, or how the scattered farm equipment created perfect cover for someone who knew exactly where each piece would be. "You've worked here for a long time?" Turner asked, his voice deceptively friendly. 5 years, sir. Mrs. Norton took me on after—" Thomas let his voice catch, as if remembering something painful. It wasn't entirely an act. The events that had driven him from his old life still haunted him. "After what?" "After my family. There was a fire." Thomas looked down, his hands trembling. Again, not entirely an act. There had been a fire 5 years ago. The one he'd started to fake his own death when too many enemies had gotten too close. The one that had finally convinced him to hang up his guns and seek a quieter life. Turner nodded sympathetically, but his eyes were cold. "Rough times out here. That's why folks need protection. Strong men to keep them safe." He gestured to his raiders, who had positioned themselves in what they thought were strategic positions around the stable yard. "Tell me, friend, have you ever noticed any strangers around here? Anyone asking questions about the valley?" "No, sir," Thomas replied. "We don't get many visitors. Mrs. Norton likes her privacy." "Smart woman," Turner said. "Privacy's valuable. And these days, speaking of which—" His hand dropped to his gun, no longer casual. "Why don't you show us what's in that locked tack room? The one with the new hinges and the reinforced door?" Thomas felt the situation shifting. The tack room was where he kept his surveillance gear. Maps marking gang movements across the territories, notes on suspected Blackwood Raider activities, and most importantly, the evidence he'd been gathering about their connection to corrupt officials in the territorial government. Old habits die hard, and he'd never quite stopped tracking the flow of evil men through his new home. Just saddles, sir," he stammered. "Mrs. Norton's afraid of thieves. Had some trouble last year with missing equipment." "Open it," Turner commanded, all pretense of friendliness gone. Now, the tackroom key trembled in Thomas's hand as he approached the reinforced door, but his mind was clear and focused. Behind him, Blackjack Turner and his raiders watched with predatory anticipation, unaware they were walking into a trap 5 years in the making. As he inserted the key, Thomas's enhanced hearing, honed by years of tracking men through wilderness, caught the subtle sound of horses approaching from the North Trail. The rest of Turner's gang, right on schedule. "Hurry up," Turner commanded, his patience wearing thin. The morning sun had risen higher, burning away the valley mist and revealing the true scale of the Norton Ranch. From this angle, Thomas could see Martha Norton's bedroom window, where he knew the elderly woman would be watching, her father's Spencer carbine at the ready. She might not know his full history, but she was no fool. She'd figured out enough over the years to know he was more than a simple farmhand. The tackroom door swung open with a well-oiled silence that spoke of regular maintenance. Thomas had designed this moment carefully, positioning everything for maximum effect. The raiders crowded forward, eager to see what secrets the nervous stable hand had been hiding. "Step aside," Turner ordered, pushing past Thomas into the room. He stopped abruptly, his professional confidence faltering as he took in the sight before him. The walls were covered with detailed maps of the territories, marked with red pins showing gang movements and criminal activities. Newspaper clippings documented various robberies and murders, connected by strings to different locations. But most disturbing were the sketches, incredibly detailed portraits of known outlaws, including several of Turner himself and his key lieutenants. "What in hell?" Turner breathed, his hand dropping to his gun. "Interesting hobby for a stable hand," came a new voice from the doorway. The raiders turned to find Clay Bennett, Turner's chief lieutenant, leading the second group of men into the stable yard. Bennett was known for his tactical thinking, and Thomas saw the moment the man's eyes took in the surveillance wall and connected it to other troubling details about the ranch. "Boss," Bennett called, his voice tight with sudden concern, "we need to—" The crack of a rifle shot cut him off, sending the raiders diving for cover. But Thomas knew Martha's shot wasn't meant to hit anyone. It was a signal, carefully arranged in advance. Right on cue, the sound of galloping hooves filled the valley as Sheriff Cooper and his deputies emerged from the aspen grove, cutting off the raiders' escape route. In the chaos that followed, Thomas moved with the fluid grace of a man shedding a long-worn disguise. His nervous stumble turned into a combat roll that brought him behind a stack of hay bales, one of many positions he'd prepared over the years. The oversized workshirt fell away, revealing a custom gun rig that had once been famous in 3 territories. "Ghost Riley," Bennett breathed, recognition and fear mingling in his voice. "They said you were dead." "I was," Thomas replied, his voice dropping to the cold tone that had once made hardened killers surrender rather than face him. "For 5 years, I was exactly what you thought, just a simple farmhand trying to live quietly." His first shot knocked Turner's gun from his hand before the gang leader could clear leather. His second shot took Bennett's hat off along with a lock of hair. "But you had to push, had to threaten the peace I'd built here." Turner, nursing his wounded hand, snarled, "You're outnumbered, Ghost. 15 to 1. Even your legend can't beat those odds." A dry chuckle from the hayloft made the raiders look up. Martha Norton's weathered face grinned down at them, her Spencer carbine rock steady. "Might want to check your math, young man. Ghost ain't alone." More movement revealed Sheriff Cooper, and his deputies had taken up prepared positions around the stable yard. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. The positions he'd spent years establishing, training the sheriff's men in secret night after night, were finally being put to use. "See, that's the thing about trying to live a peaceful life," Thomas said, keeping the raiders covered as his allies moved into position. "It gives a man time to plan, time to prepare. Did you really think I chose this ranch by accident? That I spent 5 years here just hiding?" He gestured to the surveillance wall. I've been tracking your gang since you first started operating, learning your patterns, setting up this moment." "Why?" Turner demanded. "You were Ghost Riley, the most feared bounty hunter in the territories. You could have hunted us down any time." "Because I made a promise," Thomas replied, memories of that last terrible night flooding back. "A promise to stop being the man who solved everything with violence, to find a better way." His eyes hardened. "But that promise didn't mean I'd stand by and let men like you prey on innocent people. So I found a middle path, built something here in Pine Valley, a community that could defend itself." Bennett, always the tactician, had been studying the stable yard with growing comprehension. The reinforced walls, the clear firing lanes disguised as farm equipment, the trained horses. "You've turned this whole valley into one big trap." "Not just the valley," Sheriff Cooper added, pride evident in his voice. "Ghost, Thomas, has been helping us set up similar defenses in every town along the territory line. Training deputies, establishing communications networks. While you boys were building your little empire, he was building something stronger, a community that stands together." Thomas moved forward, his stance relaxed but ready. "So, here's what's going to happen. You're going to surrender, all of you, and then you're going to tell us everything you know about the corrupt judges and lawmen who've been helping your gang operate." Turner's face twisted with desperate fury. "You think it's that simple? You think they'll let you expose them? They'll send others, worse than us. No matter how well you've prepared this valley." "That's just it," Thomas interrupted, a hint of his old Ghost Riley smile showing through. "I'm not just defending one valley. While you were watching me play stable hand, I was helping other communities. Prepare, building a network of good people who know how to stand up to men like you. Your time's over, Turner. The days of gangs like yours treating these territories as your personal hunting ground are done." A shot rang out. One of Turner's younger men, panicking, but Thomas had been ready, had seen the signs in the man's stance. His return fire was precise, deadly, and aimed at the saddle horn next to the young outlaw's head. "That was a warning," Thomas said quietly as the echo faded. "The next one won't be. I've spent 5 years trying to be a better man, trying to solve problems without killing. Don't make me break that streak." The clatter of dropping weapons filled the stable yard, as the raiders, realizing their situation, began to surrender. Thomas kept his aim steady, but inside, a weight he'd carried for 5 years was lifting. He'd found a way to use his skills, his experience, without becoming the cold-blooded killer he'd once been. Ghost Riley hadn't come back from the dead. Instead, Thomas Riley had found a way to be something better. Martha Norton's voice carried from the hayloft, thick with satisfaction. "Well, Ghost, reckon we can stop pretending you're just my stable hand now?" "Reckon so," Thomas agreed, a genuine smile crossing his weathered face. "Though if it's all the same to you, Mrs. Norton, I'd like to keep the job. Someone's got to look after those horses. Those army-trained horses you've been secretly conditioning for the sheriff's department, you mean?" Martha's eyes twinkled. "Figured that out months ago, boy. Just like I figured out those maintenance projects you were always doing were really setting up defensive positions." Sheriff Cooper moved forward to begin securing the prisoners, his deputies working with the smooth efficiency that came from Thomas's training. "Whole town knew something was different about you, Ghost. Way you carried yourself. Why were you always watching the horizons? But you proved yourself a good man, proved you really wanted that peaceful life. That's why we all agreed to help when you started suggesting ways to improve the town's defenses." Thomas nodded, touched by the acceptance in the sheriff's voice. For 5 years he'd worried that his past would cost him this new life he'd built. Instead, it had helped him protect it. But as he watched Turner and his raiders being led away, a nagging concern tugged at his mind. Turner's words about others and corrupt officials weren't just empty threats. "Sheriff," Thomas called, his voice carrying the authority of Ghost Riley rather than the stable hand's usual quiet tone. Those papers in the tack room. I need your deputies to get them to Judge Wilson in Copper Springs immediately. He's one of the few we can trust. Cooper's eyebrows rose. You've been building a case? 5 years of evidence, Thomas confirmed. Bank records, witness statements, telegraph transcripts. Everything linking the Blackwood Raiders to 3 territorial judges and half a dozen corrupt marshals. Turner and his men were just the muscle. The real power's been hiding behind respectability and law badges. Martha Norton climbed down from the hayloft with surprising agility for her age. That's why you really came here, isn't it? Not just to hide, but because Pine Valley sits at the crossroads of 3 territories. Perfect place to gather intelligence. Thomas smiled slightly. The old woman had always been sharper than she let on. Partly, but mostly because you were the first person who offered me work without asking questions. Gave me a chance to prove I could be something more than just a killer. Speaking of questions, Bennett spoke up from where he sat with the other prisoners. There's something I've been wondering. That fire 5 years ago, the one that was supposed to have killed Ghost Riley? His eyes narrowed thoughtfully. That was right after you took down the Carson brothers. Thomas's expression hardened. The Carson job had been his last as Ghost Riley. 3 brutal brothers who'd turned an entire town into their private kingdom. He'd brought them in, but the cost had been too high. The Carsons had friends in high places, Bennett continued. Same ones backing us. After you took them down, they put a price on Ghost Riley that brought every killer in the territories looking for you. So I died, Thomas said simply. Burned down my cabin with enough evidence to convince them they'd succeeded. Walked away from the bounty hunting life. And just happened to walk into the perfect position to investigate the corruption that went all the way to the top. Bennett finished, respect and wariness mingling in his voice. Life's funny that way, Thomas replied, but his mind was already racing ahead. The papers he'd collected would expose the entire corrupt network, but the men behind it wouldn't go down easily. They'd send others, just as Turner had warned. Martha seemed to read his thoughts. Don't even think about running, boy. This is your home now. Whatever comes, we face it together. Sheriff Cooper nodded in agreement. Every town you've helped, every deputy you've trained, they'll stand with us. The days of men like Turner thinking they can rule through fear are ending. Thomas felt the weight of his gun belt, so familiar after years of pretending it wasn't part of him. He'd spent 5 years trying to balance his desire for a peaceful life with his need to protect others. Looking at the captured raiders, the loyal sheriff's deputies, and the fierce old woman who'd given him a chance at redemption, he realized he'd finally found that balance. First things first, he said, holstering his weapon. We need to get those papers to Judge Wilson. Then he looked at the rising sun, painting Pine Valley in shades of promise. Then we show the territories what happens when good people stand together against evil men. And if they send more guns, one of the younger deputies asked nervously. Thomas's smile held echoes of Ghost, Riley's legendary confidence, tempered, now by wisdom and purpose. Then we'll be ready, because they're not just facing one man anymore. They're facing communities that know how to defend themselves, and that's something no amount of corrupt judges or hired guns can stand against. As if to emphasize his point, the sound of approaching horses filled the valley, reinforcements from neighboring towns, right on schedule. Thomas had spent years building these connections, teaching other communities what he'd taught Pine Valley. The corrupt officials who'd thought they could control the territories through gangs like the Blackwood Raiders were about to learn a hard lesson about the power of united, prepared communities. Best get these prisoners secured, Sheriff Cooper ordered. Something tells me we're going to be busy for a while. Thomas nodded, already planning the next steps. The capture of Turner's gang wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a larger campaign to clean up the territories. But this time, he wasn't fighting alone. Ghost Riley had been a legend because of his ability to track and capture the worst outlaws in the West. Thomas Riley would leave a different kind of legacy. Communities that stood together, protected each other, and proved that justice didn't always need to come from the barrel of a gun. Martha Norton's voice broke through his thoughts. After we're done with all this law and justice business, those stable floors still need sweeping. Thomas laughed, a real laugh that held no traces of Ghost Riley's cold demeanor. Yes, ma'am, horses come first. That's one lesson I've learned for sure. 2 days after the capture of the Blackwood Raiders, an unusual gathering filled Martha Norton's dining room. Maps and documents covered the large oak table, illuminated by lamplight as evening settled over Pine Valley. Thomas Riley stood at the head of the table, his weathered hands tracing routes between settlements, while Sheriff Cooper and deputies from 3 different territories listened intently. Judge Wilson received the evidence, Cooper reported, running a hand through his graying hair. He's already issued warrants for Judge Hartford in Copper Springs and Marshal Reynolds in Black Rock Territory, but he hesitated, exchanging glances with his deputies. They're gone, Thomas finished, unsurprised, along with bank records, witness statements, anything that could implicate them further. It wasn't a question. He'd expected this. Corrupt officials didn't survive this long by being careless. Cleared out their offices, emptied their accounts, a deputy from Black Rock confirmed. Word is they're gathering forces, calling in every gunman and corrupt lawman who owes them favors. Martha Norton, presiding over this war council with the same practical efficiency she brought to running her ranch, set a fresh pot of coffee on the table. How many are we talking about? At least 50 men, Thomas answered, his mind already calculating odds and strategies. Not just common outlaws, but experienced killers, former lawmen gone bad, bounty hunters who work both sides of the law. His finger tapped a point on the map. They'll gather here at Eagles Crossing. It's defensible, close to the territorial borders. And most importantly, he looked up, meeting the gathered lawmen's eyes. It's where they're holding their hostages. A murmur ran through the room. Hostages? Cooper asked sharply. 3 families, Thomas confirmed grimly. Witnesses who were going to testify about the corruption. Judge Hartford's men grabbed them before they could reach Judge Wilson. Standard tactic, ensure cooperation through threats rather than just violence. How do you know this? One of the younger deputies demanded. Thomas's smile held no warmth. Because it's what I would have done back when I was Ghost Riley. Take hostages, force a confrontation on the ground of your choosing. They're trying to bait us into a trap, and we're just going to walk into it, Martha asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. No, Thomas replied, pulling out a more detailed map of Eagles Crossing. We're going to spring their trap, but not in the way they expect. Sheriff, those reinforcements I asked you to call in, how many responded? Cooper's chest swelled with pride. Every town you helped train over the past 5 years, 30 deputies, 20 civilian volunteers, all experienced with the defensive tactics you taught them. They're gathering at Devil's Fork, waiting for orders. Thomas nodded, pleased but not surprised. The network of mutual support he'd helped build was proving its worth. And the special equipment I requested arrived this morning. Mining charges, signal flares, and those modified rifle sights you designed. Still don't understand how they work in the dark, though. They don't have to, Thomas explained, shifting some papers to reveal detailed sketches of Eagles Crossing's terrain. They just have to make Hartford's men think they do. Fear and uncertainty are weapons just as powerful as bullets, something I learned long ago. Martha studied the maps with a shrewd eye. You've been preparing for this too, haven't you? All those mysterious trips to check on horse trading opportunities these past 5 years. I was scouting, Thomas admitted, mapping every possible location they might use if things went wrong. Eagles Crossing is perfect for their purposes. Naturally defensible, clear lines of sight, multiple escape routes. But it has weaknesses they don't know about. He pointed to several marked locations. Underground springs have created cave systems throughout the area. Most people think they're just shallow shelters, but I spent 3 months mapping them 5 years ago. They run deep, connect in ways that aren't obvious from the surface. A way they won't expect, Cooper breathed, understanding dawning. More than that, Thomas continued. Those caves affect sound in strange ways. A shot fired in one location echoes as if it came from another. In the dark, with the right preparation, you can make 20 men sound like 100. One of the more experienced deputies finished. Make them think they're surrounded when they're not. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. This was why he'd spent years training these men. They understood strategy, thought beyond simple gunfights. Exactly. But first, we need to get the hostages out. That's where you come in, Mrs. Norton. Martha raised an eyebrow. Me? Hartford's men are watching for law badges and known fighters. They won't look twice at a respectable widow driving her wagon to market, especially not one who's known for making regular supply runs to Eagle's Crossing. And the fact that my wagon has that false bottom you installed last year, that's just coincidence. Martha's eyes twinkled with unexpected excitement. Pure coincidence, Thomas agreed solemnly. Just like it's a coincidence that you've been seen arguing with me publicly lately, claiming I'm not doing my job properly. Anyone watching will think you're just a stubborn old woman who won't listen to her stable hand's warnings about traveling dangerous roads. Cooper leaned forward. The hostages will be moved tomorrow night to a new location. Hartford's men will use 3 wagons, taking different routes to confuse any pursuit, but they'll all pass through Eagle's Crossing. They have to. It's the only place with bridges strong enough to support heavy wagons this time of year. And that's when we hit them? A deputy asked eagerly. That's when Martha makes her move, Thomas corrected. The rest of us will be getting into position, but carefully. No large groups moving together, no obvious preparations. Hartford scouts are watching every trail. We go in 1s and 2s, looking like ordinary travelers, settlers, traders. Take different routes, arrive at different times. He pulled out another map, this one showing the surrounding territories. Meanwhile, Judge Wilson's men will be making a very obvious show of force here at Copper Springs, making Hartford think we're gathering for a frontal assault. The more men he pulls in to defend against that threat, the fewer will be watching for our real moves. What about you? Cooper asked quietly. Hartford has to know Ghost Riley's involvement by now. They'll be watching for you specifically. Thomas's expression hardened. They're watching Ghost Riley, the legend, the man who works alone, who appears out of nowhere to deliver justice. They're not watching for Thomas Riley, the simple stable, and who likes to drink at Eagle's Crossing saloon and complain about his employer's stubbornness. Understanding rippled through the room. Thomas had spent 5 years perfecting his role as the quiet farmhand. Now that same disguise would let him walk right into the heart of enemy territory. It's risky, Martha said, but her tone was approving. Hartford's men might buy the Grieving Widow Act from me, but you'll be surrounded by killers who want Ghost Riley dead. Good thing Ghost Riley is dead then, Thomas replied with a grim smile. Died in that fire 5 years ago, remember? All they'll see is a man who's had too much to drink, who's worried about his employer's safety, but too cowardly to do anything about it. He looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. This isn't just about catching corrupt judges or stopping hired guns. This is about showing everyone in the territories that justice doesn't come from fear and violence. It comes from communities working together, from good people willing to stand up and help each other. Cooper nodded slowly. And when it's done, when Hartford and his men are caught, then we keep building, Thomas said simply. Keep teaching. Communities to defend themselves, to support each other. The territories don't need legends or lone heroes. They need neighbors who watch out for each other, lawmen who serve justice rather than power. Martha's voice cut through the moment of reflection. That's all very inspiring, but right now we need to focus on details. Thomas, that wagon won't load itself, and if I'm playing the stubborn widow, I need to practice complaining about my lazy, stable hand. The room filled with quiet laughter, breaking the tension as the gathered lawmen began discussing specific assignments and timing. Thomas felt a familiar calm settling over him. This wasn't the cold focus of Ghost Riley preparing for violence. This was something better, the quiet confidence of a man who had found his true purpose. The next few days would test everything he'd built over the past 5 years. Not just his plans and preparations, but the very idea that justice could be served without becoming the kind of violent men they were fighting. As he looked at the determined faces around the table, Thomas Riley knew he'd made the right choice. 5 years ago, Ghost Riley had been a legend, but legends faded. What these people were building together, that would last. "One more thing," Thomas said as the meeting began to break up. "Hartford's not working alone. The money trail I've uncovered leads to someone bigger, someone with connections in the territorial capital." He pulled out another document, this one showing a complex web of financial transactions. Every bank robbery, every protection racket, 20% of the takes were being funneled through a series of legitimate businesses, all leading back to one man, Senator James Morrison. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Morrison was one of the most respected men in the territories, known for his speeches about law and order. He'd been pushing for increased military presence, claiming the territories needed a stronger response to lawlessness. "Now we see why," Cooper growled. "Create the problem, then sell yourself as the solution. Classic Morrison play." Thomas nodded. "He's been building this network for years. The corrupt judges, the crooked marshals, gangs like the Blackwood Raiders, they're all just pieces in his bigger game. Control the territories through fear, then step in as their savior." "That's why you really came to Pine Valley, isn't it?" Martha asked quietly. "Not just to hide, but because you were already on Morrison's trail 5 years ago." "The Carson brothers' case," Thomas confirmed. "I found documents linking them to Morrison. That's why the price on Ghost Riley's head was so high. Morrison couldn't risk someone connecting the dots." One of the deputies whistled softly. "So when you faked your death, I needed to disappear long enough to build a real case, something not even Morrison's connections could bury." Thomas spread out more papers. Bank records, witness statements, coded telegrams, 5 years of evidence gathering, all pointing to Morrison as the mastermind. Cooper studied the documents with growing concern. This goes beyond corrupt officials. Morrison's been manipulating the entire territory, staging raids to drive down land prices, then buying up property through shell companies, using the gangs to control trade routes, and using the fear they create to justify his calls for military control, Thomas finished. "Once he has army units stationed throughout the territories, answering to him, he'll have himself a private kingdom," Martha concluded grimly. "All nice and legal-looking on the surface." Thomas gathered the documents carefully. "That's why this isn't just about stopping Hartford and his gunmen. We need to expose the whole operation, show people how Morrison's been playing them." "It's a big risk," Cooper warned. "Morrison has friends in high places, real power." "But he's never faced anything like this," Thomas replied, gesturing to the gathered lawmen. "Individual sheriffs and deputies he can corrupt or intimidate. But united communities working together, that's something his kind never expects." A young deputy named Jenkins spoke up. "What about the hostages? If Morrison realizes we're onto him, he'll try to silence them permanently," Thomas agreed. "Which is why our timing has to be perfect. Martha's Wagon Act isn't just about getting close to the hostages. It's about making Hartford think we don't know about the Morrison connection. Let them believe we're just after corrupt local officials." "A trap within a trap," Cooper mused. "While they're watching for Ghost Riley's dramatic return, We're actually building a case that goes all the way to the territorial capital." Thomas allowed himself a grim smile. Morrison built his power through shadows and fear. Let's see how he handles the light of truth. As the meeting disbanded, with deputies heading out to their assigned positions, Martha held Thomas back. "You're not telling them everything, are you, about what really happened 5 years ago?" Thomas met her knowing gaze. The old woman had always seen more than she let on. "No," he admitted quietly. "Some ghosts need to stay buried, at least until Morrison's dealt with." Martha nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Well, whatever shadows you're still carrying, you're not alone anymore. Remember that when the shooting starts." Thomas watched her leave, then turned back to the maps and documents. Tomorrow, he'd play his role as the disgruntled stable hand. But tonight, he had preparations to make. Morrison's web of corruption had taken years to build. Taking it down would require every skill Ghost Riley had possessed, combined with everything Thomas Riley had learned about trust and community. The sun had set over Pine Valley, painting the sky in shades of promise and warning. Thomas Riley stood at the window, watching darkness settle over the land he'd chosen to protect. Tomorrow would test everything he believed about justice and redemption. But for now, he had work to do. The stables wouldn't clean themselves, and a good cover story required attention to every detail. Eagle's Crossing looked peaceful in the early morning light, but Thomas Riley's trained eye noted every armed man trying to look casual on the dusty streets. Hartford's men were good. They stayed in the shadows, maintained natural-looking patterns of movement. But to someone who'd spent years hunting the territory's deadliest outlaws, their presence was as clear as signal fires. Thomas slouched against the saloon's bar, playing his role to perfection. His clothes were deliberately disheveled, his speech just slurred enough to suggest a man seeking liquid courage. To any observer, he was exactly what he claimed to be: a worried stable hand drinking away his anxiety about his employer's stubborn insistence on making her supply run. "Ain't right," he muttered to anyone who'd listen. "Respectable widow like Mrs. Norton, heading out with all these rumors about bandits. Told her it ain't safe, but does she listen? Might as well talk to them. About horses." The saloon's other patrons gave him the dismissive looks he'd expected. Just another coward trying to drink away his fear. Perfect. What they didn't notice was how his apparently random stumbling gave him clear views of every corner of the room, how his mumbled complaints contained coded messages for Cooper's deputies, scattered throughout the town. Through the window, he spotted Martha's wagon approaching right on schedule. She played her part beautifully, scolding him loudly as she passed. "You better have those stables cleaned properly when I get back, Thomas Riley, and stay out of my good whiskey." He made a show of cringing, earning snickers from the armed men, trying to blend in with the morning crowd. But his keen eyes caught what they missed: Martha's subtle hand signal confirming she'd spotted the hostages. They were being held in the abandoned mining office, just as his intelligence had suggested. A commotion at the edge of town drew attention. One of Hartford's scouts rode in hard, kicking up dust. "Riders coming. Big group, moving fast from the south." Thomas watched Hartford's men snap to attention, their casual poses forgotten. Right on schedule, Cooper's forces making their obvious approach, drawing eyes and resources exactly where he wanted them. "Close the town." A harsh voice commanded. Thomas recognized Wade Barrett, Hartford's chief enforcer, emerging from the mining office. "Get those hostages ready to move. No chances." The next few minutes were carefully orchestrated chaos. Hartford's men scrambled to defensive positions, preparing for what they thought was an assault from the south. None of them noticed Thomas, stumbling drunkenly toward the livery stable, or how his path took him past key points he'd mapped out days ago. Inside the stable, he found exactly what he'd expected: 3 wagons being prepared for the hostages' transport. but something was wrong. The wagons were different from the ones his scouts had reported, heavier and built with reinforced beds. Looking for something, Ghost? Thomas turned slowly. In the stable's shadows stood a figure he hadn't seen in 5 years, Sarah Carson, sister to the notorious Carson brothers he'd brought down in his last job as Ghost Riley. She'd been barely more than a girl then, watching as he'd taken her brothers to justice. Now she held herself with the cold confidence of a professional killer. "Hello, Sarah," he said quietly, dropping the drunk act. "Still working on the wrong side of the law, I see." Someone had to carry on the family business. Her gun was rock steady, aimed at his heart. "After you destroyed it, your brothers destroyed themselves. I just brought them to justice." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Justice? Is that what you call working for Morrison? Being his personal cleaner when deals go bad?" Thomas kept his expression neutral, but his mind raced. This was new information. Sarah thought he'd been working for Morrison all along. "You've got it wrong." "Do I?" She gestured to the reinforced wagons. "These aren't for hostages, Ghost. They're for gold. Morrison's been stockpiling it for months, using Hartford's operation as cover. Today's supposed hostage transfer is really about moving his war chest. The hostages are just window dressing." Thomas reassessed the situation rapidly. If Sarah was telling the truth, it changed everything. That much gold could fund Morrison's takeover of the territories for years. But something didn't add up. "Why tell me this?" he asked carefully. "If you think I work for Morrison—" "Because I finally figured it out," Sarah replied. 5 years ago, after you took down my brothers, Morrison put that massive bounty on your head, but it wasn't because you caught them. It was because you found something that scared him enough to want Ghost Riley dead." Memory flashed. A hidden ledger in the Carson brothers' stronghold, names and numbers that hadn't made sense at the time. "Your brothers weren't just outlaws," Thomas said slowly. "They were bankers for Morrison's whole operation." "Smart as ever, Ghost." Sarah's grip on her gun never wavered. "Morrison thought he'd buried that connection when you died. Imagine his surprise when evidence starts surfacing, all pointing to his operation. Evidence only someone with Ghost Riley's skills could have gathered. So he sent you to confirm his suspicions and to deliver a message." Sarah's eyes hardened. "Walk away, Ghost. Take your evidence to Judge Wilson if you want. Morrison owns enough senators to bury any investigation. But leave the gold. Let today's operation proceed, or Martha Norton had an unfortunate accident on her supply run, along with every other person in Pine Valley you've grown to care about." Her smile was cold. "Morrison knows everything, Ghost, about your network of trained deputies, your prepared communities. One word from him, and a dozen bandit raids hit those towns simultaneously." Thomas felt the familiar ice in his veins, the deadly focus that had made Ghost Riley legendary. But now it was tempered by something else. 5 years of building connections, of learning there were more ways to fight evil than just violence. "You're right about one thing, Sarah," he said quietly. "I did find something 5 years ago. Not just evidence about Morrison, but something more important." He met her eyes steadily. "I found out that people can change, that there's always a choice." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm offering you the same choice I made 5 years ago. Morrison's using you just like he used your brothers. Help us take him down. Help us protect innocent people instead of threatening them." Sarah's gun wavered slightly. "Pretty words from a man who killed my family." "I brought your brothers to justice," Thomas corrected. "They chose to resist, to shoot rather than surrender. Just like you have a choice now." A tense silence filled the stable. Outside, they could hear Hartford's men preparing for what they thought was an assault from Cooper's forces. But Thomas and Sarah remained locked in their own private standoff, two professionals who'd walked very different paths from similar beginnings. "Morrison will kill everyone you care about," Sarah warned. but there was uncertainty in her voice. "Now, no," Thomas replied with quiet confidence. "He'll try, but he doesn't understand what we've built here. Individual threats he can handle, individual people he can corrupt or intimidate, but communities standing together, that's something. Men like Morrison can never truly fight." Sarah's gun lowered fractionally. "You really believe that? After everything you've seen as Ghost Riley?" "I believe it because of everything I've seen since, as Thomas Riley, as a man who found something worth protecting." He held out his hand. "Help us make it right, Sarah. Help us take down the man who really destroyed your family." Sarah Carson's gun clattered to the stable floor. The sound was lost in the growing chaos outside, but to Thomas Riley it echoed like a thunderclap. 5 years of planning had led to this moment, and now everything would change. "The gold shipments," Sarah said quickly, her professional demeanor taking over. "They're not just in these wagons. Morrison's got 3 more convoys moving through the territories, all converging on Fort Revelation within the week. He's planning something big." Thomas moved to the stable window, checking positions as Hartford's men scrambled to defend against Cooper's apparent assault. "How big?" "Army paymasters are arriving at the fort in 5 days. Morrison's going to use the confusion of multiple bandit attacks to steal the army's gold, then blame it on territorial lawlessness. He'll finally have his excuse to bring in military control. And his own gold shipments will disappear in the chaos, mixed in with the army's losses. No one will be able to trace where the real gold went." Sarah joined him at the window, her trained eye assessing the tactical situation. "Your sheriff's men are good, but they're too obvious. Hartford's got shooters on the hotel roof and more in the church tower." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. "Look again, really look." Sarah frowned, then her eyes widened. "The shooters. They're not moving right. Those aren't Hartford's men at all." "Judge Wilson's marshals," Thomas confirmed. "Been in position since before dawn. Hartford's real men are tied up in the root cellar of the hotel. Your old friends aren't as loyal as Morrison thinks. Money buys cooperation, but trust earns true loyalty." A wagon wheel crunched on gravel outside, Martha Norton's supply wagon making another pass through town. Thomas caught the subtle signal in her apparently random movements. The hostages were ready. "Morrison's got a man inside Wilson's office," Sarah warned. "Benjamin Drake, Wilson's own clerk. He intercepts messages, changes orders." "We know," Thomas replied calmly. "Been feeding him false information for weeks. Right now he thinks Wilson's forces are gathering for a massive raid on Copper Springs. That's why Hartford's reserves are out of position." Sarah's professional appreciation was evident. "You've been playing a long game, Ghost." "Thomas," he corrected. "Ghost Riley worked alone. Thomas Riley builds alliances." He turned to face her fully. "Speaking of which, those other gold convoys. We'll need routes, schedules, and recognition signals." Sarah nodded, already pulling paper from her coat. "Morrison's using a complicated rotation. Different routes each day, changed at the last minute, but there's a pattern." She began sketching. Quickly. "The real information is coded into supply requisitions. Look at the quantity numbers." A shot cracked outside, closer this time. The battle for Eagle's Crossing was intensifying, but Thomas knew it was mostly for show. The real action was happening. And quietly, behind the scenes, as Martha's wagon made its way toward the mining office where the hostages were held. "Hartford's getting nervous," Sarah observed, noting the increasing agitation among the visible gunmen. "He knows something's wrong, but can't put his finger on it, because he's looking for Ghost Riley's style, dramatic direct action. He's not watching for Martha Norton's sewing circle." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Her what?" As if on cue, shouts of alarm erupted from the mining office. Hartford's men were rushing towards some disturbance, only to find themselves confronted by what appeared to be a group of respectable women who had, accidentally, tangled their wagons in front of the building. "Ladies' Aid Society," Thomas explained, with quiet pride. Been meeting every Wednesday for 5 years. Anyone watching just saw a social club. What they didn't see was Martha teaching them military hand signals and close quarters combat. Through the window, they watched the seemingly helpless women spring into action with practiced coordination. Hartford's men, unwilling to shoot respectable townsfolk, found themselves expertly herded away from the mining office. In the confusion, other figures slipped inside. Cooper's deputies, moving according to the plan they'd rehearsed for months. Morrison, never understood, Thomas continued. He thinks power comes from fear and violence, but real strength, that comes from the community, from people choosing to stand together. Speaking of Morrison, Sarah interjected, you should know he's not at Fort Revelation. The Army paymasters are a diversion. While everyone's focused on the fort, Morrison will be meeting his real partners at Echo Canyon. Representatives from mining companies, railroad barons, even foreign investors. Once he has military control of the territories, he'll sell them to the highest bidder. Thomas's expression hardened. That's why he needs the gold. Not just for bribes and payments, but to prove to his investors that he can deliver. A new commotion drew their attention. Hartford himself had emerged from the hotel, bellowing orders as his men fell back under the increasingly coordinated assault. But Thomas noticed something in the man's bearing, a tension that went beyond tactical concerns. Hartford's received new orders, Sarah confirmed, reading the signs. Morrison must have a backup plan. He always does, Thomas agreed. That's why we have one too. Sheriff? Cooper's voice carried clearly from his hidden position, near the livery. Ready when you are. Judge Wilson's riders are in position on all escape routes. Thomas turned back to Sarah. Last chance to back out. Once we move on Morrison himself, there's no middle ground. Sarah Carson, sister to the notorious Carson brothers, looked around at the unfolding scene. She saw Hartford's men, supposedly ardent killers, being systematically outmaneuvered by a community that had spent years preparing for this moment. She saw Martha Norton coordinating her sewing circle with the precision of a military unit. Most importantly, she saw what her brothers had died trying to protect, the possibility of justice in a world of corruption. Morrison has a private telegraph line, she said finally, runs through Dead Horse Junction. He uses it to coordinate his operations, send orders that can't be traced through regular channels. Thomas nodded, understanding the implicit commitment in her words. Martha's been training pigeons for the past year. Messages can reach our people in Dead Horse Junction within hours. Pigeons. Sarah couldn't help but laugh. Ghost Riley using carrier pigeons. The world really has changed. Had to, Thomas replied simply. Can't fight corruption with just bullets. Have to be smarter, more connected. Build something stronger than one man's legend. Another series of shots rang out. The prearranged signal that the hostages were secure. Thomas moved toward the stable door, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. What now? Sarah asked, falling naturally into a supporting tactical position. Now, Thomas Riley, once known as Ghost. Riley allowed himself a grim smile. Now we show Morrison what happens when he mistakes quiet preparation for weakness. You've seen what one small town can do when its people stand together. Imagine what happens when we link all the communities he thought he controlled. He'll still have his army connections, his corrupt officials, who are about to discover that every document, every secret account, every piece of evidence your brothers gathered has been delivered to newspaper offices across 3 territories. Thomas's eyes held the quiet certainty of a man who had spent 5 years building toward this moment. Morrison thought Ghost Riley died in that fire. He never understood that Thomas Riley could be more dangerous, not because of skill with a gun, but because he learned how to trust, how to build real strength through community and Echo Canyon. Sarah's professional mind was already analyzing angles, approaches. That's where you come in. Morrison, expecting Ghost Riley to work alone, make some dramatic last stand. Instead, he's going to face something he can't fight. The truth, delivered by the sister of the men he betrayed, backed by evidence that can't be buried, and communities that won't be intimidated. Sarah checked her spare gun, a habit born of years in Morrison's service. It won't be easy. He'll have protection, contingency plans. Good thing we've got 5 years of preparation and a few hundred determined citizens on our side. Thomas opened the stable door, revealing the now secure street where Hartford's men were surrendering to Cooper's deputies. Ready to help us. Finish what your brothers started? Sarah Carson looked at the man who had once been her family's nemesis, understanding finally what her brother James had seen. Not just a legendary bounty hunter, but someone who could help build a better world. Ready. Together, they stepped out into the morning light, where Martha Norton was already organizing the next phase of their plan. The battle for Eagle's Crossing was won, but the real fight, the one that would determine the fate of the territories, was just beginning. The geologist's eyes lit up. Every tunnel, every shaft. Been mapping that whole system for years, including... She smiled grimly. Several passages Morrison's men don't know about. Martha Norton, who had been quietly organizing her sewing circle members to secure the town, joined the discussion. My ladies aren't just good at causing distractions. Several were nurses during the war. They know how to move wounded through tight spaces, set up field hospitals. And the mining. Community's always taken care of its own, Phillips added. Every town in these territories has old mine tunnels, connections that don't show up on official maps, ways to move people and supplies without being seen. Thomas saw the pieces falling into place. Morrison had spent years building his empire, on fear and isolation, never understanding that the very communities he sought to control had their own networks, their own ways of resisting tyranny. Sarah, he turned to his former enemy, now an unexpected ally. Those convoys you mentioned, how many men are guarding each one? 10, maybe 12. Professional gunmen, all loyal to Morrison. Loyal or afraid? Thomas pressed. How many would switch sides if they knew the truth about the Carson brothers, about how Morrison betrays his allies once they're no longer useful? Sarah considered this. Some, maybe enough to matter, especially if they see Hartford's men surrendering here, realize Morrison's power isn't absolute. Then we use that, Thomas addressed the group. Morrison expects Ghost Riley to make some dramatic last stand. Instead, we're going to dismantle his operation piece by piece, turn his own men against him, expose his secrets, all while he's gathering his conspirators in one place. It's risky, Cooper warned. If even one convoy gets through, if one group of guards stays loyal, that's why we work together, Thomas replied firmly. Each community targets one convoy. Use the mine tunnels, the local knowledge. Morrison thinks he's fighting lone lawmen, scattered resistance. Show him what happens when people unite. Martha nodded approvingly. My ladies have been practicing more than just distraction techniques. Some of them are quite good with those new Winchester rifles Thomas here accidentally left lying around the ranch. And Morrison's private telegraph. Line? Sarah asked. Once we start moving, he'll try to coordinate a response. Already handled, came a new voice. Young Jenkins, one of Cooper's deputies, entered with a triumphant grin. Just got word from Dead Horse Junction. Seems somebody... He winked at Martha. Released about 50 pigeons carrying false messages. Morrison's communications are going to be a bit confusing for a while. Thomas felt a familiar calm settling over him, not Ghost Riley's cold focus, but something warmer. This was what he'd spent 5 years building, not just defenses or fighting skills, but connections, trust, real strength. Dr. Hayes, he turned. To the geologist, how long would it take to get your maps to every mining town in Morrison's territory? With the right network, she caught on quickly. Every mining community has its own courier system. Ways of passing information that outsiders never notice. Give me 3 hours. You have 2. Phillips, we'll need your knowledge of army procedures. Morrison's men are used to forged orders. Let's give them some they won't expect. The former. Quartermaster nodded eagerly. Sarah, Thomas faced his one-time hunter. You know Morrison's operation from the inside. Which men might turn, which will stay loyal to the end. We'll need that knowledge. And you? Martha asked, though her smile suggested she already knew. I'm going to give Morrison exactly what he expects. Ghost Riley, making one last dramatic appearance. Thomas's eyes held a dangerous glint. While he's focused on the legend he thinks he killed 5 years ago, the real threat will be all around him. Every community he thought he'd conquered, every person he thought he'd cowed through fear. United, Cooper finished simply. United, Thomas agreed. Morrison built his power on shadows and fear. Let's show him what happens when people step into the light, together. Dusk painted Echo Canyon in shades of purple and gold as Thomas Riley studied the converted mining complex through his spyglass. Morrison's headquarters was exactly as Dr. Hayes had described, a natural fortress carved into the canyon walls with modern additions carefully disguised to look like abandoned mining equipment. Main entrance is well covered, Sarah Carson whispered from her position beside him. At least 20 men, professional security, not local muscle like Hartford used. She adjusted her own spyglass. And those aren't just mining machines. See those new steam engines? Gatling guns, Thomas confirmed grimly. Disguised as industrial equipment, Morrison's not taking chances. They lay hidden among the rocks overlooking the canyon, while behind them an unprecedented operation was quietly taking shape. The old mining tunnels Dr. Hayes had mapped were now filled with determined citizens from a dozen communities. Ranchers, shopkeepers, miners who'd lost claims to Morrison's schemes, all armed and trained thanks to 5 years of careful preparation. First, "Convoy's been stopped," came a whispered report from young Jenkins, who'd crawled up to their position. "Timber Creek militia hit them just like you planned. Most of Morrison's men surrendered as soon as Sarah's letter was read to them." Thomas nodded approvingly. Sarah's detailed account of Morrison's betrayal of the Carson brothers, backed by evidence they'd gathered, was proving devastatingly effective at turning his hired guns' loyalty. "Second convoys trapped in Blackwood Pass," Jenkins continued. "Martha's Ladies' Aid Societies blocked the road with a broken-down wagon train. When Morrison's men tried to threaten their way through, they discovered society women are mighty accurate with those new Winchesters." "And the third?" Sarah asked tensely. "That's the interesting part." Jenkins grinned. "They ran straight into a military patrol at Snake River Crossing. Really just miners and ranchers in old army uniforms, but with Phillips coaching them on proper military procedure. Morrison's men followed their own protocols," Thomas finished. "Surrendered to what they thought was superior military authority." "Not one shot fired," Jenkins confirmed proudly. Sarah shook her head in amazement. 5 years of planning showing its worth. But Morrison's no fool. He'll realize something's wrong when those convoys don't arrive. "That's what we want," Thomas replied. "Let him get nervous. Start making mistakes." He shifted his spyglass to study the canyon's southern approach. "How many investors have arrived?" 4 carriages in the last hour, Sarah reported. Recognized Marcus Blackwood from the Railroad Consortium and that British mining magnate, Lord Kensington. "Morrison's selling them more than just gold and mineral rights," came a new voice. Dr. Hayes had joined them, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent years mapping these mountains. "Those documents the Army paymasters are carrying, they're patents for new mining equipment, ways to extract minerals faster, cheaper." "Military applications?" Thomas asked. "Some. Explosives mainly. But the real value is in the industrial potential. Morrison's investors aren't just buying gold, they're buying the future of mineral extraction in these territories." Thomas absorbed this information, adding it to the complex web of Morrison's schemes they'd uncovered. The man's ambitions went beyond mere criminal empire building. He was trying to control the territory's entire economic future. A flash of movement caught his eye. Another carriage approaching the mining complex. This one was heavier built, with armed outriders. "Sarah?" Judge Hartford, she confirmed, grimly. "Morrison's pet judge himself, and he looks worried. Word of Eagle's Crossing must have reached him." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. Hartford's arrival meant their plan was working. The corrupt judge would bring news of their victory, of how a small town's preparedness had defeated his supposedly unbeatable enforcers. "There's something else," Dr. Hayes added, consulting her maps. "Those steam engines aren't just disguised weapons. They're actually functional mining equipment. Morrison's been testing the new extraction methods here, proving to his investors that he can deliver, which means there's more evidence inside," Sarah realized. "Physical proof of how he's been stealing technical secrets, not just gold." A bird call echoed through the canyon, one of Cooper's signals. Thomas raised his spyglass again, noting new movement at the complex's entrance. Armed men were deploying in defensive positions, their behavior showing heightened alertness. "They're spooking," Sarah observed professionally. "Missing convoys, Hartford's arrival. Morrison's men can sense something's wrong." "Good!" Thomas began moving back from their observation post. "Time for the next phase. Dr. Hayes." The geologist produced detailed drawings of the mining complex's interior. Lower tunnels are mostly original mine workings, but Morrison's added steel doors, guard posts. Upper levels have been converted to offices, meeting rooms. But here, she pointed to a series of narrow passages. Old ventilation shafts. Too small for most men, but perfect for some of Martha's more adventurous ladies, Thomas finished. "And the main water pump station? Still uses the original reservoir. Cut that and their steam engines stop working. No power for those hidden Gatling guns." Jenkins whistled softly. "You really did think of everything." "Had to," Thomas replied. Simply, Morrison spent years building his power through fear and corruption. Breaking that means being smarter, more prepared. He turned to Sarah. "Ready for your part?" The former enforcer nodded grimly. "Morrison's men know me. They'll let me approach, especially if I'm bringing urgent news about Ghost Riley being spotted. And once you're inside, I know where he keeps his private safe, all his real records, the documents that could destroy dozens of powerful men." Her eyes hardened. "The evidence that would have saved my brothers, if we'd found it in time." Thomas clasped her shoulder briefly. "Just remember, you're not alone this time. The whole canyon is surrounded, every escape route covered by people Morrison never thought could resist him." "Speaking of resistance," Jenkins cut in, "Martha sends word. Her ladies are in position at all 3 reservoir access points. They're ready to move on your signal." Dr. Hayes studied her maps one final time. "Mining crews are standing by too. Every shaft, every tunnel that connects to Morrison's complex, we've got people ready to move through them." Thomas took a moment to appreciate the scale of what they'd built. Morrison thought power came from fear, from having the most guns or the most gold. He never understood that real strength came from community, from people choosing to stand together against corruption. "Send the signals," he ordered, quietly. "Tell Martha's groups to start moving on the reservoir. Mining crews begin their approach through the lower tunnels, and Cooper already moving into position," Jenkins confirmed. "His men will be ready to block the main entrance once Sarah's inside." Thomas checked his weapons one final time, not with Ghost Riley's cold efficiency, but with the careful determination of a man who'd found something worth fighting for. "Morrison expects Ghost Riley to make some dramatic last stand," he said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Instead, he's going to face something he can't fight with guns or money. Communities united against corruption." Sarah smiled grimly. "Looking forward to seeing his face when he realizes the sister of the men he betrayed helped bring him down." That's not why we're doing this, Thomas reminded her gently. This isn't about revenge. It's about justice. About showing everyone in these territories that they don't have to live in fear. A series of bird calls echoed through the canyon, Martha's ladies beginning their approach to the reservoir. Thomas Riley, once known as the legendary Ghost Riley, now something more important, a symbol of community resistance, gave the final signal to begin their assault on Morrison's fortress. The plan they'd spent 5 years preparing was in motion, but as Thomas knew from long experience, no plan survives first contact with the enemy completely intact. Morrison had survived and prospered this long because he was clever, adaptable. The question was, could a united community prove more adaptable than a corrupt empire? A flicker of movement caught Thomas's attention. A new group of riders approaching the complex from the north. Something about their formation set off warning bells in his trained mind. "Sarah," he whispered urgently, "those riders, look at how they're spaced." She studied them through her spyglass, then cursed softly. "Military formation, but those aren't real soldiers." "Pinkerton agents," Thomas confirmed grimly. "Morrison's called in professional help. That changes things." Dr. Hayes looked worried. "The Pinkertons have a reputation for being thorough. If they start searching the canyon systematically—" "They'll find our people in the tunnels," Jenkins finished. "All our preparations—" "No," Thomas cut him off. "This is good. Morrison's showing his hand early. He's scared enough to call in outside help, which means—" "He knows he's vulnerable," Sarah realized. "The Pinkertons are his insurance policy." Thomas's mind raced ahead, adapting their plans. "Jenkins, get a word to Cooper. His men need to change into the mining company uniforms we prepared. Dr. Hayes, how many legitimate mining claims are registered in this area?" The geologist caught on quickly, pulling out documentation from her satchel. 3 active claims within sight of the complex, all properly filed and registered. "Perfect. Sarah, you'll need to adjust your approach. The Pinkertons will be watching for anyone suspicious, but they're also professionals. They'll respect legitimate business." "So I become a mining company representative?" Sarah nodded, understanding. "Here to discuss Morrison's offer to buy out our claim. Common enough transactions in these parts. And while the Pinkertons are focused on verifying your credentials, Martha's ladies will already be inside through the ventilation shafts." Dr. Hayes finished. "Brilliant. The Pinkertons will be looking for armed men, not respectable women doing maintenance work." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. "Morrison's made a mistake. Bringing in the Pinkertons shows he's thinking like Ghost Riley would, expecting direct confrontation, professional gunmen. He's not watching for quilting circles and mining engineers." A series of quick hand signals from their lookouts indicated more movement around the complex. The Pinkerton agents were deploying with professional efficiency, establishing a security perimeter that would have stopped any normal assault cold. "They're good," Sarah admitted, studying their positioning. "Standard diamond formation, overlapping fields of fire. But they're all watching outward, not inward," Thomas agreed. "They're expecting an attack, not an infiltration. Dr. Hayes, how long would it take a normal mining inspection team to verify a claim dispute?" "Standard procedure is at least 2 hours," she replied. "Full documentation review, site inspection, equipment inventory. That's our window then. Sarah, you'll lead the inspection team. Dr. Hayes, you'll be her mining expert. Jenkins, get word to Martha. Her ladies need to be in position before the inspection begins. Once the Pinkertons are focused on the legitimate business happening at the front gate, the real operation comes up through the tunnels," Sarah finished. "But what about you? Morrison will be expecting Ghost Riley to make an appearance." Thomas checked his weapons one final time, but his movements were measured, controlled. Not the cold efficiency of his bounty hunter days, but the careful preparation of a man who'd learned better ways to fight. He'll get exactly what he expects. Thomas said quietly. Ghost Riley making one last dramatic stand, the kind of thing legends are made of. That's suicide, Sarah protested. Even if you get past the Pinkertons, who said anything about getting past them? Thomas's eyes held a glint of his old strategic brilliance. Morrison's obsessed with Ghost Riley's legend. He'll be watching exactly the kind of dramatic attack I was famous for, so we'll give him one. Out there in the open, where everyone can see it. Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. A distraction, while he's focused on finally defeating Ghost Riley. He won't notice what's happening right under his nose. Thomas gestured to the complex. All those powerful investors gathered to see Morrison's demonstration of power. Instead, they'll see something very different. Dr. Hayes studied the terrain thoughtfully. The tunnels come up right under the main meeting room, where Morrison plans to show off his stolen patents and mineral surveys, and where Martha's ladies will be waiting, Thomas confirmed, along with every piece of evidence we've gathered about his operation, while Ghost Riley keeps everyone's attention with one last legendary stand. The real power move comes from ordinary people standing together, Jenkins finished, admiration clear in his voice. Thomas nodded, then turned to Sarah. Your brothers died trying to expose Morrison's corruption from the inside. Today, we do it from the outside, not through violence or legends, but through the strength of united communities. A bird call signaled that Martha's first group had reached their position near the reservoir. Thomas Riley, who had once been the most feared bounty hunter in 3 territories, prepared to become a legend one last time. But this time, the legend wasn't about one man's skill with a gun. It was about something more powerful, the courage of ordinary people choosing to stand against corruption. Time to move, he said quietly. Dr. Hayes, get your mining documents ready. Sarah, remember, you're not the Carson brothers' vengeful sister now. You're just another mining representative tired of Morrison's pressure tactics. And you? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Thomas Riley smiled, and for a moment they saw the shadow of Ghost Riley in his eyes. I'm going to give Morrison exactly what he's been waiting 5 years to see. One last chance to kill the legend that's haunted him. His expression hardened. Just don't let him notice the real threat until it's too late. As they moved to their positions, Thomas reflected on how different this was from his days as Ghost Riley. Back then, he'd worked alone, trusting only his skills and instincts. Now he was part of something larger, a community of people who'd chosen to stand together against corruption. Morrison was about to learn the hard way that legends might die, but the power of united people was something that couldn't be killed. The setting sun cast long shadows across Echo Canyon as William Morrison stood in his converted mining office, studying the latest telegrams with growing unease. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, the same instinct that had helped him build his empire. 3 gold convoys, all missing. Hartford's operation in Eagle's Crossing, completely silent. And now these disturbing reports about united community resistance. Sir, his aide interrupted nervously. The Pinkerton chief wants to report. Morrison waved him in, not looking up from the telegrams. Augustus Reed, chief of the Pinkerton detachment, entered with military precision. The man's starched collar and immaculate suit seemed out of place in the frontier mining office. Report. Perimeter is secure, Mr. Morrison. No sign of Ghost Riley or any other hostile forces. However, Reed hesitated, choosing his words carefully. We've had an unusual request. Representatives from the Three Sisters Mining Company are here for a claim dispute inspection. Morrison's head snapped up. What inspection? Fully documented, sir. They have territorial registry papers, survey maps, everything in order. Standard. Procedure requires we allow them access for assessment. Before Morrison could respond, another aide burst in. "Sir, the water pressure in the main reservoir is dropping. Chief engineer says we need to inspect the pumping station immediately." Morrison's unease grew. Something about this felt wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on why. The mining inspection was legitimate. He'd seen Three Sisters claim stakes himself, and mechanical problems were common in mining operations. Yet, "My investors arrive in an hour," he said finally. "We can't afford any disruptions. Reed, verify the mining company's credentials thoroughly and get someone to that pumping station." "Already done, sir. The maintenance crew arrived 10 minutes ago. Older women been handling the canyon's waterworks for years, according to their documentation." Morrison walked to the window, studying the canyon's deepening shadows. 5 years ago, he'd thought he'd ended the threat of Ghost Riley. The bounty. Hunter had been too close to uncovering his operation, and had found documents linking him to the Carson brothers. The fire that allegedly killed Riley had been a master stroke, or so he'd thought, but lately things have changed. Communities that should have been covered by his power were showing unexpected resistance. Local lawmen were working together instead of competing, and now these small disruptions, just as his most important meeting approached. "Sir," Reed prompted, "about the mining inspection." "Let them proceed," Morrison decided, "but watch them closely and double the guard on the main vault. Those patents and mineral surveys represent everything we've built. Without them, our investors—" A commotion outside drew their attention. Riders approaching fast from the north, one of his patrols returning ahead of schedule. The patrol leader, dust-covered and urgent, burst into the office moments later. "Sir, Ghost Riley's been spotted." Morrison's blood ran cold. "Where?" "Thunderpass, moving this way." "Got a clear look at him. Same silver-mounted Winchester, same style. He's not even trying to hide." Reed raised an eyebrow. "Curious timing, just as we're dealing with these other matters." Morrison's mind raced. Ghost Riley had been a legend for his ability to appear where least expected, to strike from impossible angles. But this was too obvious. Unless— "The mining inspection," he said slowly. "The water pressure problems. They're diversions." "Sir." Reed looked skeptical. "The paperwork is impeccable, and those maintenance women are all local, and have been working these canyons for years." "That's just it," Morrison muttered. "Everything's too perfect. Ghost Riley was never about perfect plans. He was about dramatic action, impossible shots." He turned to his aide. "Who exactly verified those maintenance workers?" "Standard territorial documentation, sir. Martha's Ladies Maintenance Cooperative. They handle waterworks all through these parts." Martha. The name triggered something in Morrison's memory. A report from Hartford months ago about a widow's ranch in Pine Valley. A ranch with a suspicious stable hand. "Reed, get men to that pumping station now, and find that mining inspection team." But even as he barked orders, Morrison knew it was starting. The patient, careful plan he'd somehow missed while watching for Ghost Riley's dramatic return. 5 years of preparation he'd never noticed, because he'd been looking for the wrong thing. Gunfire erupted from the canyon's north end, Ghost Riley making his appearance, drawing attention and resources exactly where he wanted them. Morrison found himself torn between responding to the immediate threat and investigating his growing suspicions about the mining inspection. "Sir, what are your orders?" Reed demanded. "Ghost Riley is—" "A distraction," Morrison finished grimly. "But from what?" Inside the mining complex's countless tunnels and passages, Martha Norton's maintenance crew was already moving with practiced efficiency. Dr. Hayes's mining inspection team had the Pinkertons' complete attention at the main gate. Their paperwork so perfect, it demanded thorough verification. And in the deepening shadows, Thomas Riley prepared to give Morrison exactly what he expected. One last legendary appearance of Ghost Riley. But the real action was happening elsewhere. Sarah Carson, dressed in mining company attire, was already Past the first security checkpoint, her documentation, carefully prepared over months, listed her as Eleanor Hayes' assistant. The Pinkerton agent examining her papers had no way of knowing he was clearing the sister of the notorious Carson brothers. "Everything seems in order," the agent said finally. "Though I'm curious, why request an inspection now, with all the recent unrest?" "Precisely why," Sarah replied smoothly, playing her role perfectly. "Our investors are nervous about Morrison's expansion plans. They want updated survey data, clear documentation of claim boundaries." She smiled professionally. "You know how it is. People need everything in writing." The agent nodded sympathetically, completely missing the irony of her words. Just as Morrison had missed the real threat building in his territories, not lone gunmen or legendary bounty hunters, but communities united against corruption. More gunfire echoed from the north. Ghost, Riley's distinctive rifle crack, drew Pinkerton agents and Morrison's men like moths to flame. Thomas was giving them a show, a reminder of the legend that had haunted Morrison for 5 years. But in the converted mining complex's lower levels, Martha's maintenance crew was achieving their real objectives. The women moved with the quiet efficiency of people who'd spent years preparing for this moment. Each carried tools that could serve multiple purposes: repair wrenches that could disable locks, maintenance kits containing skeleton keys and lockpicks. "Pressure's dropping in the main reservoir," one of Morrison's engineers reported urgently. "We need to—" "I've got my best crew on it," the maintenance supervisor, actually Martha Norton herself, assured him. "Just need access to the—" "Lower pump room," the engineer hesitated. "That's restricted." "Son," Martha fixed him with a stern look perfected over decades of managing ranch hands, "do you want to explain to Mr. Morrison why his demonstration equipment failed in front of his investors, or do you want to let us fix the problem?" While this drama played out, Sarah Carson was conducting her own careful performance. The mining inspection proceeded with meticulous attention to detail, each step documented precisely. The Pinkerton agents watching her had no idea that her careful measurements and notes were mapping more than just claim boundaries. "These geology samples," she said professionally, examining rocks that had been placed specifically for this moment, "they're quite unusual. We'll need to check the original survey maps. They should be in the main office." Morrison's aide, eager to prove his efficiency, led her exactly where she needed to go. "All the documentation is filed here, though given the security situation—" "Of course," Sarah agreed smoothly. "We'll need to examine everything thoroughly. These claim disputes can get quite technical." In his office, Morrison paced like a caged tiger, torn between responding to Ghost Riley's apparent attack and addressing his growing suspicions about the mining inspection. The familiar crack of that silver-mounted Winchester drew his attention north again. But something wasn't right. "Reed," he called sharply. "When Ghost Riley was active, what was his signature?" The Pinkerton chief consulted his notes. "According to our files, he preferred a close-range work. Expert tracker would get inside his target's defenses before revealing himself. This long-range shooting isn't his style at all," Morrison finished. "It's what people expected of him, what the legends said, but not how he actually worked." His eyes narrowed. "He's showing us exactly what we expect to see. Which means—" A massive explosion rocked the complex, but not from the north where Ghost Riley was putting on his show. The blast came from below, from the supposedly secure pump room where Martha's maintenance crew had been working. "Sir!" An aide rushed in. "The water pressure! It's not just dropping. The whole system's been rigged. When it blows—" Morrison finally understood, but the realization came too late. Ghost Riley had never been the real threat. The legend had been reborn as something far more dangerous, a symbol around which communities could unite against corruption. The next few minutes would determine not just Morrison's fate, but the future of 3 territories. And somewhere in the growing chaos, Thomas Riley allowed himself a grim smile. Ghost Riley's legend had served its purpose. Now it was time for ordinary people to show their true strength. The explosion's aftermath brought a new kind of chaos to the mining complex. Water from the sabotaged pumping system began flooding the lower levels, but not randomly. Martha's crew had engineered the damage precisely, forcing Morrison's men to evacuate exactly the areas they needed to clear. "Sir!" Another of Morrison's aides burst in, clutching fresh telegrams. "We're getting reports. Ghost Riley's been spotted in 3 different locations, simultaneous sightings, miles apart." Morrison's face darkened. "Impossible." "Unless," Reed interjected thoughtfully, "we're not dealing with one man anymore. The legends become something else." Before Morrison could respond, Lord Kensington entered, his aristocratic features twisted with concern. "Morrison, what is the meaning of this? Your men are running around like headless chickens, and I've just been informed our demonstration will be delayed due to technical difficulties." "My lord," Morrison began smoothly, "I assure you—" "And who are all these people?" the British investor demanded. "Mining inspectors, maintenance crews. This was supposed to be a private demonstration of your operations capabilities." In the corridor outside, Sarah Carson continued her meticulous inspection, carefully documenting everything while her trained eye noted guard positions and security patterns. The Pinkerton agents watching her had no idea that her careful measurements were being transmitted through a complex series of signals to teams waiting in the old mining tunnels. More explosions rocked the complex, smaller this time, but strategically. Unplaced, the water from the damaged pumping system was forcing Morrison's men to abandon key positions, creating gaps in their security that Martha's people quickly exploited. "The patents!" Morrison suddenly shouted. "Reed, get men to the vault, now!" But the Pinkerton chief hesitated. "Sir, Ghost Riley is a distraction." Morrison's composure finally cracked. "This whole thing, the inspection, the maintenance, problems. They're not here to kill me, they're here for the evidence." Even as he spoke, Martha Norton's maintenance crew was accomplishing their real mission. Years of working the canyon's water systems had given them intimate knowledge of every pipe, every access point. The flooding wasn't random. It was driving Morrison's men away from specific areas while creating new routes for Cooper's deputies to infiltrate the complex. In the main office, Sarah Carson made her move. "Given these structural concerns," she announced professionally, "we'll need to examine the original survey maps, including the ones in your secure storage." Morrison's aide, now thoroughly flustered by the chaos around them, began to object, but Lord Kensington interrupted. "Oh, let them see whatever they need. Perhaps they can explain why your supposedly secure facility is falling apart." "My lord," Morrison tried again, "these are sensitive documents which I and my fellow investors have paid handsomely to verify," Kensington snapped. "Or are you suggesting you have something to hide?" It was the perfect trap. Morrison couldn't refuse access without arousing his investors' suspicions, but allowing the inspection team in would expose everything. And all the while, Ghost Riley's distinctive rifle fire kept drawing attention and resources to the canyon's north end. In the flooded lower levels, Martha's crew was discovering damaged documents that had mysteriously floated out of secure storage, documents that would soon find their way to Judge Wilson's office. The water damage would explain why Morrison's meticulous filing system had been disrupted, making it impossible to prove what had been taken and what had simply been destroyed. "Sir," Reed reported tensely, "we've lost contact with the teams guarding the south tunnel entrance, and the water's rising in the main storage area." Morrison stared out his window at the chaos engulfing his carefully built empire. The distant crack of Ghost Riley's rifle had stopped, but now he could hear something else, movement in the canyon. Lots of movement. My God, Reed breathed, looking through his spyglass. The whole canyon surrounded, every mining town, every ranch. They've all sent people. Not to fight, Morrison realized finally. To witness. He turned to find Lord Kensington and his fellow investors watching him with growing suspicion. To see exactly what kind of operation they've been investing in. Sarah's voice cut through the tense silence. Speaking of operations, Mr. Morrison, perhaps you'd like to explain these discrepancies in your mineral surveys. Our records show these claims were legally registered to independent miners who mysteriously disappeared after, shall we say, encountering difficulties with local bandits. The evidence was mounting, carefully presented in ways Morrison couldn't counter without revealing his larger schemes. Each piece had been gathered over 5 years of patient work, and now it was all coming together, not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through the careful coordination of ordinary people who'd had enough of corruption. Morrison, Lord Kensington's voice was cold. I believe you have some explaining to do, starting with why these mining records show equipment being paid for with army funds, yet registered to private companies. The trap was complete. Morrison had spent years building his power through fear and corruption, always watching for dramatic threats like Ghost Riley. He'd never noticed the real danger growing right under his nose. Communities uniting, sharing information, preparing to stand together against tyranny. And somewhere in the growing crowd of witnesses surrounding the canyon, Thomas Riley watched his 5-year plan unfold. Ghost Riley's legend had served its purpose, drawing attention and resources exactly where they were needed. But the real victory belonged to the ordinary people who'd chosen to stand together against corruption. The sun had set on Echo Canyon, but a new day was dawning for the territories. Morrison's empire wasn't being destroyed by a legendary bounty hunter's bullets, but by something far more powerful, the light of truth, revealed by united communities who'd found their strength together. William Morrison hadn't built an empire by giving up easily. As his carefully constructed world began crumbling around him, a cold calculation replaced his initial panic. He still had cards to play, resources and contingencies that even Ghost Riley couldn't have discovered. My lord, he addressed Kensington, smoothly, these apparent discrepancies have a perfectly reasonable explanation, one that involves certain sensitive government contracts. He moved toward his private office, where a hidden wall safe contained documents that could still save him. But Sarah Carson was faster. Actually, Mr. Morrison, those government contracts are exactly what our inspection needs to verify, particularly these irregular payments from military accounts. She produced a ledger that made Morrison's blood run cold. His brother's personal record book, thought destroyed in the fire that had allegedly killed Ghost Riley. Impossible, he breathed. That burned. Did it? Sarah's professional demeanor cracked slightly, showing a glimpse of the Carson sisters' steel beneath. Or did Ghost Riley save more than just evidence that night? Before Morrison could respond, another explosion rocked the complex. This one from an unexpected direction. The backup generator room, which shouldn't have been accessible to anyone outside his inner circle, went up in a massive fireball. "Sir!" Reed rushed in. "We've lost power to the security doors, and the vault—" "What about the vault?" Morrison demanded sharply. "It's already open. Has been for at least an hour. The logs show it was accessed using valid credentials. Your credentials." Morrison's mind raced. The vault required 3 separate keys, held by different trusted men. Unless— He looked at Sarah with new understanding. "The mining inspection. While we were verifying your credentials, you were so busy looking for Ghost Riley's dramatic attack that you never noticed the real threat," she confirmed. 5 years of building trust, creating legitimate businesses, establishing paperwork that could withstand any scrutiny. Tell me, did you even check whether Three Sisters Mining Company was really owned by your allies? A commotion in the corridor drew their attention. Martha Norton entered, still wearing her maintenance crew overalls, but her bearing was anything but servile. Behind her came Cooper and his deputies, wearing mining company uniforms that now displayed official U.S. Marshal badges. "William Morrison," Cooper announced formally. "By the authority of Judge Wilson and the United States government, you're under arrest for corruption, fraud, and conspiracy against the territories." Morrison laughed sharply. "You have no jurisdiction. Here, this is a private mining operation with full military contracts." "About those contracts," came a new voice. Colonel James Bradford of the U.S. Army stepped into view, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos around them. "We've been conducting our own investigation into certain irregularities. Your pet judges aren't the only ones who can issue warrants." Mr. Morrison, Lord Kensington and the other investors were backing away, their faces showing varying degrees of shock and calculation. Morrison could almost see them deciding how to distance themselves from his operation. But he still had one last card to play. "Ghost Riley," he called out suddenly. "I know you're watching. You want me? Come and get me yourself. Face me like the legend you pretend to be." He's not pretending to be anything anymore. Thomas Riley stepped into the office, but not in some dramatic entrance. He walked in calmly, deliberately, still wearing his simple farmhand's clothes. The man who had once been the most feared bounty hunter in 3 territories didn't need theatrics anymore. That's what you never understood, Morrison. Ghost Riley was just a legend, a story that worked because men like you believed in it. But legends don't change things. People do. Communities working together, standing up against corruption. That's real power. Morrison's hand dropped to his hidden derringer, but before he could move, Sarah's gun was already trained on him. She'd shed her mining company disguise, revealing the professional gunfighter's rig beneath. "Don't," she said quietly. "My brothers died because they trusted you. Don't make their sister finish what Ghost Riley started. You still don't see it, do you?" Thomas moved closer, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had found a better way to fight evil. "Look around. Every person in this room represents someone you thought you could control through fear or greed. Martha Norton, whose ranch you tried to pressure. Sarah Carson, whose brothers you betrayed. Colonel Bradford, whose honest soldiers you tried to corrupt. And behind them," Martha added, "every community you thought you'd conquered, all those small towns and farms you dismissed as unimportant. While you were watching for Ghost Riley's dramatic return, we were building something stronger than any legend." Morrison's calculating mind finally grasped the full scope of what had happened. 5 years. You spent 5 years setting this up. The stable hand job, the community connections, the legitimate businesses, it was all preparation for this moment. "Not just preparation," Thomas corrected. "I found something worth protecting. Communities of good people who just needed to learn how to stand together. Ghost Riley hunted alone. But Thomas Riley, he builds alliances." Colonel Bradford stepped forward. "Your entire operation is exposed, Morrison. Army investigators have been watching your gold shipments, tracking how you've been using military contracts to cover your criminal enterprises. Judge Wilson's federal warrants are being executed across 3 territories right now." "Simultaneously," Cooper added with professional satisfaction. "Every corrupt judge, every bought lawman, every criminal ally, all being arrested at the same moment. No one to help you, no one to hide behind." Morrison's eyes darted around the room, seeing his carefully built empire crumbling. But something still bothered him. The timing, Ghost Riley's attacks, the maintenance problems, the mining inspection, it's too perfect, too coordinated. Because it wasn't one plan, Thomas explained. It was hundreds of small plans, all working together. Every community contributed what they could. Martha's ladies learned water systems and security patterns. Mining towns shared their knowledge of tunnel networks. honest lawmen built networks of trust. While you were looking for the legendary Ghost Riley, Sarah added, you never noticed Thomas Riley building something far more dangerous, hope, the kind that makes ordinary people stand up against corruption. Morrison's last attempt at defiance crumbled as he saw the truth in their words. Through the office windows, he could see the canyon filled with people. Not just lawmen and deputies, but ordinary citizens, ranchers, miners, shopkeepers, all coming to witness his fall. Your investors have already withdrawn their support, Colonel Bradford reported. Lord Kensington and the others are cooperating fully, providing evidence of your attempts to sell military secrets along with territorial resources. And those missing gold shipments, Cooper smiled grimly, never existed. We let you think they'd been hijacked, but they were army shipments all along, empty wagons, part of the investigation. Your real gold, the one you'd been stockpiling, already secured, documented, and on its way to federal custody. Martha Norton stepped closer, her weathered face showing satisfaction. You spent so much time building walls to keep people out, you never noticed us building bridges to bring them together. Ghost Riley died in that fire 5 years ago, Thomas said quietly. But something better was born from those ashes. Not a legend of one man's justice, but a story of communities united against corruption. Morrison's shoulders slumped as the full weight of his defeat settled over him. He'd been outplayed, not by a legendary bounty hunter, but by something he'd never thought to guard against. The power of ordinary people choosing to stand together. As Cooper and his deputies led the fallen empire builder away, Thomas Riley watched from the office window. The sun was rising over Echo Canyon, painting the sky in shades of promise. Ghost Riley's legend had served its purpose, drawing attention and resources exactly where they were needed. But the real victory belonged to the communities that had found their strength together. So, Sarah said quietly, coming to stand beside him, what happens now? Thomas smiled, thinking of Martha's ranch, of the quiet life he'd built there. Now? Now we keep building, keep teaching communities to stand together to support each other. The territories don't need legends anymore. They need neighbors who watch out for each other, people who choose to fight corruption with unity instead of violence. The morning light caught the badge on Cooper's chest as he organized the final arrests. Not a lone lawman star anymore, but a symbol of communities working together for justice. Ghost Riley's legend had faded into history, replaced by something far more powerful, the strength of united people standing against tyranny. But even as Morrison was led away in chains, Thomas noticed something in the man's bearing, a subtle tension that suggested this wasn't over yet. His instincts, honed by years of hunting the territory's most dangerous men, warned him that Morrison had one last desperate play to make. Sarah, he said quietly, check his coat, left side. She moved with professional efficiency, ignoring Morrison's protests. From a hidden pocket, she withdrew a small key. Safety deposit box, she announced, examining it. First National Bank of Denver. Morrison's face showed a flicker of fear, the first real emotion they'd seen from him. Colonel Bradford stepped forward, suddenly alert. That matches the intelligence we've received. Morrison's been sending coded messages to contacts in Denver. More than contacts, Thomas replied grimly. Insurance. The kind of documents that could destroy honest officials across 3 territories. The threat that kept good people quiet while he built his empire. Cooper frowned. Denver's out of our jurisdiction, even with federal warrants. That's why. He chose it, Morrison spoke finally, a hint of his old confidence returning. You may have taken my operation, Riley, but I still have enough evidence to ruin every honest man who ever opposed me. One telegram to my associates in Denver. You mean these associates? Martha Norton stepped aside as 2 more figures entered, Judge Wilson himself, accompanied by a distinguished-looking woman none of them had seen before. Margaret Pinkerton, The woman introduced herself crisply. Head of our agency's Western Division, and as of 3 hours ago, proud owner of a certain safety deposit box in Denver. Morrison's composure cracked completely. Impossible. The bank's protocols were followed exactly, Judge Wilson confirmed with satisfaction. Proper warrants, valid documentation, and most importantly, the right key. He nodded to the one Sarah had just discovered. Though I suppose we should thank you for keeping a spare. Thomas watched understanding dawn in Morrison's eyes. The Pinkerton agents, they weren't just here for security. A proper investigation requires multiple approaches, Margaret Pinkerton confirmed. While Mr. Reed's team provided visible security, drawing your attention, other agents were following different leads, including certain banking irregularities. In Denver, your own pattern of corruption defeated you, Thomas added quietly. You were so used to buying people's loyalty that you never considered some might have deeper principles, even among the Pinkertons. Morrison sagged in his bonds, finally comprehending the full scope of his defeat. Every contingency, every backup plan, every insurance policy, all had been systematically dismantled by the very communities he'd tried to control. The documents from Denver are already on their way to Judge Wilson's office, Margaret continued professionally, along with evidence from our own investigations into corruption across the territories. It seems Ghost Riley wasn't the only one. Building cases against you these past 5 years, Sarah Carson studied the woman thoughtfully. The Pinkertons have been investigating Morrison all along, among others, Margaret confirmed, but we needed something more than just our evidence. We needed communities willing to stand together, Thomas finished. People choosing to resist corruption openly, providing public testimony that could support official investigations. Colonel Bradford nodded in approval. A proper cleansing of the territories required both official action and public support. Neither could succeed alone. Martha Norton's weathered face showed deep satisfaction. That's what you really built these past 5 years, Thomas. Not just defense plans or fighting skills, but bridges between official justice and community action. Morrison listened to this exchange with growing despair. His carefully constructed world hadn't just been defeated. It had been systematically dismantled by an alliance he'd never imagined possible. Professional investigators working alongside community. Groups, official law enforcement supported by organized citizens. One question, Sarah said, turning to Thomas. That night, 5 years ago, you didn't just find evidence in my brother's stronghold, did you? You found something else. Thomas nodded slowly. Found your brother James's real records. Not just evidence of Morrison's corruption, but proof that they were gathering it for a reason. They weren't just criminals, Sarah. They were building a case, trying to protect you from what they knew was coming. And the fire? The one that supposedly killed Ghost Riley? Had to be convincing, Thomas admitted. Morrison needed to believe Ghost Riley was dead, so Thomas Riley could work quietly, build something stronger than one man's legend. Margaret Pinkerton smiled slightly. When our agency received a detailed, anonymous report about the Carson brothers' evidence 5 years ago, we began our own investigation. Ghost Riley's death provided excellent cover, everyone watching for dramatic action while we built official cases. Morrison's last hope died as he realized the truth. His empire hadn't been brought down by a legendary bounty hunter's dramatic return. It had been dismantled piece by something far more powerful, the coordinated action of communities and law enforcement, working together openly and in secret. Take him to the federal wagon, Cooper ordered his deputies. Along with all the evidence we've gathered, Judge Wilson's court is ready to begin proceedings immediately. As Morrison was led away, Thomas Riley looked out over the canyon, now filled with citizens who'd chosen to stand against corruption. Ghost Riley's legend had served its purpose, drawing attention and resources exactly where they were needed. But the real victory belonged to something more lasting. The power of communities united with official justice, building something stronger than any one person's fight. "You know," Sarah said quietly, "my brothers would have liked this, not just bringing Morrison down, but how it was done, building something better than just revenge." Thomas nodded, thinking of all the changes the past 5 years had brought. Ghost Riley hunted alone, bringing justice one target at a time. But Thomas Riley, he found a better way, helping communities build their own strength, connect with official law enforcement, create lasting change. The sun climbed higher over Echo Canyon, its light touching not just Morrison's fallen empire, but the foundations of something new rising in its place. Not built on fear or corruption, but on the strength of united communities working with honest law enforcement. The legend of Ghost Riley had faded into history, but the legacy of Thomas Riley was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.